Saudi Arabia has just ditched the US dollar and they've ended their most important deal with the United States. Saudi Arabia will no longer be selling oil exclusively in US dollars. Instead, they will now be trading in both the Chinese yuan and the Russian ruble. And the reason for this is that Saudi Arabia has decided not to renew their 50-year petrodollar deal with the US. Since 1974, this deal meant that Saudi Arabia was only allowed to sell their oil in US dollars. And it's worth knowing that this petrodollar deal was one of the few things that has been propping up the US dollar around the world. And with them losing this deal, it means you could actually see the US dollar slowly losing its place as the global reserve currency. And now it's simply up to Saudi Arabia to decide which currencies they will be replacing it with, except they've said that they've now chosen the Chinese and the Russian ones. But if you don't know, members of BRICS have announced plans for a blockchain-based cryptocurrency. And all of the countries of BRICS will be using this, and it seems the purpose of this will be to overtake the US dollar. And if Saudi Arabia was to choose this BRICS currency, it's very likely you could see the US dollar facing a huge devaluation. But Saudi Arabia did say, when they were talking about what currencies they may use in the future, that they could actually consider using crypto, like this BRICS currency. Not only that, but with Saudi Arabia ending this petrodollar deal with the US, it means that the global demand for the US dollar has actually decreased. Originally, countries needed to buy US dollars in order to buy Saudi Arabian oil. But now these countries can obviously use their own currency, which means there's a massive drop in the demand for the US dollar. And like anything, with less demand, the value drops, and the US dollar is going to face huge devaluation potentially because of this. But if you're new, this is my weekly news recap where I summarize all of the important news from the last week. Staying on global trade though, Russia announced on Monday that they're going to be sending record numbers of coal to India. Not only that, but they're actually going to be sending it via the new BRICS transport railways that connect Russia to Iran. And then from Iran, it will head on ships to India. And because of this, it's going to take just 15 days to transport the coal to India, rather than 45 days if they were to use the original Western shipping lanes. Russia announced they'll be sending 73.2 million tons of coal to southern Iran, where Iran have prepared 300 cargo ships to take that to India. And on top of this, Iran is expected to make billions of dollars just for transporting this coal. So this really is a massive trade deal between Russia and India worth tens of billions of dollars. And this announcement by Russia was made at the BRICS Transport Ministers Summit that was taking place in St. Petersburg 2 weeks ago. So it's clear that BRICS is also trying to take over the shipping lanes along with the global reserve currency, as I mentioned in the last point. But it's obvious the West doesn't like this new BRICS shipping lane idea because the US has actually threatened sanctions onto India for going ahead with this deal. In fact, India actually ignored this and they announced that they're going to be funding the largest shipping port in Iran. And this shipping port is the Chabahar port, and it's going to connect these railways to the rest of the world through the sea. And that port will also be connecting countries in the east like China, Indonesia and India to countries in Eastern Europe and Southwest Asia, along with obviously providing a quick direct route to Russia. So it's obvious that the West is actually slowly losing their global control. Staying on Russia though, for the first time Putin has given a speech publicly offering a ceasefire to Ukraine. In a speech he made on Friday, Putin put forward his 5 demands for a ceasefire, and I'm going to go through them all now. The first point he made was that Ukraine must first withdraw all of their troops from the fighting areas in eastern Ukraine. Specifically 4 parts of Ukraine being Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. Except it's worth noting that part of these areas Ukraine still currently controls. So if Ukraine was to withdraw from these areas, they would be handing over Ukrainian territory to Russia. To add to this point, Putin did say that he will grant all of the Ukrainian soldiers safe passage and he won't attack any of them whilst they're leaving. The second point he made is that Ukraine must never be allowed to join NATO. Now, Putin regularly says that NATO expansion is one of the main reasons he went into Ukraine. So from his perspective, it is understandable why he doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. But it is worth noting that NATO does seem hesitant to allow Ukraine to join because it would obviously be increasing the tensions with Russia. So it's likely that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO anyway. The third point of the 5 that he made is that Ukraine must never be allowed to have nuclear weapons. And it's obvious why Russia would want this. The fourth point is that all Western sanctions that have been placed on Russia must be lifted immediately. Putin said the West must guarantee that all sanctions will be lifted for this ceasefire deal to go ahead. And the final and controversial point of this deal is that all occupied Ukrainian territory must remain Russia forever. The deal must guarantee that Russia keeps control of both Crimea and the 4 other regions I mentioned in the first point. Now, Ukraine, NATO and the US have each responded to this deal, except I'll get to Ukraine's point in a moment. The The NATO Secretary General said that Russia should be the ones withdrawing and not Ukraine. And the US Defense Secretary said that Russia is not in any position to dictate the terms of a ceasefire deal. But what Ukraine says is the important part. Ukraine has actually rejected this ceasefire deal, and they say the reason for this is that they can still defeat Russia and they can still take back control of Crimea. Although there is basically no proof that they're going to be able to do this, it's up to them whether they accept it or not. Keeping on Ukraine though, Russia has now been ordered to pay $500 billion to help rebuild Ukraine. Last week, the 50th G7 summit was taking place in Italy, and part of those meetings were discussing funding for Ukraine. And on top of this, those 7 leaders issued a joint statement calling on Russia to pay to rebuild Ukraine. And the World Bank, who they referenced in their statement, estimated that $486 billion is the cost of what it's going to be to rebuild Ukraine. The statement by those G7 leaders said, "We are considering all possible legal avenues for Russia to pay this." Except it goes without saying that $500 billion is basically impossible to come up with. So it's highly likely that this statement is just not going to be listened to by anybody. Now, as soon as that G7 summit finished early last week, the Ukraine Global Peace Summit started taking place in Switzerland. And these G7 leaders, along with Zelensky in Ukraine and loads of other countries, came together to discuss having peace in Ukraine. Now, although this was called a peace summit, the actual goal of this was to discuss getting more funding to Ukraine. And because of this, most of the world leaders who aren't affiliated with the West either left or just said that they're not interested in that. But specifically, these European leaders discussed selling the frozen Russian assets in Europe and then giving that as money to Ukraine to help them fight their war. But it's also worth noting that these European leaders actually refused to invite Russia to this peace summit. So it seems to me more like a sales pitch from Zelensky rather than an actual peace summit. But regardless, almost all news articles agree with me on that, and they say that not much progress was made in this peace summit. Moving over to Sweden now, on Friday they intercepted a Russian MiG-24 fighter jet that flew into their airspace. Sweden says they tried to warn the fighter jet multiple times, but it failed to respond as it was flying towards the Swedish island of Gotland. And just a few moments after these warnings, Sweden scrambled 2 Gripen fighter jets to intercept this Russian MiG-24. Except it does appear that as soon as the Swedish aircraft reached the jet turned around and it left Swedish airspace. But this came just 5 days after Finland reported that they suspected Russia of violating their airspace too. They say that 2 Russian fighter jets and 2 Tu-95 long-range bombers violated their airspace last Monday. Except it's worth noting that this is actually quite a normal thing. Except some people are saying that this was Russia carrying out an exercise where they were testing these countries' response times. Although Russia hasn't said that themselves. Except one thing to remember is that back in March, Sweden did actually join NATO. So this could also be Russia trying to show Sweden that they aren't afraid of them even though they've just joined NATO. Moving to the Middle East, on Thursday, the Houthis announced that they successfully hit the Greek-owned ship called the Tutor. Now, the crew of that ship reported that they had lost control of the ship, and just 4 days later, the US Navy airlifted them off. The US Navy Eisenhower fleet, which is positioned in the Red Sea, announced that they had successfully airlifted this crew off of the ship, and they will presumably be flown home. Now, US CENTCOM says that the ship's engine room was hit, and there was too much water flowing into that engine room for them to fix it. Except if it did sink, it would actually be the second ship that the Houthis have sunk. The first being the British-owned bulk carrier called the Rubimar back in February. Moving to Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved his 6-member war cabinet. And this came just a few days after one of the key members, Benny Gantz, decided to leave. He says the reason he left is because the war is unwinnable and Israel has made terrible decisions. And another reason he said is that Netanyahu failed to give him a plan of what was going to happen in Gaza after they had won their war. Except how this affects the war itself is obviously yet to be known. Now, one of the last points, this week Russia has been doing military exercises in Cuba, and the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that these military drills were successful. On top of that, they said that they even simulated missile attacks on targets from over 600 kilometers away. Now, Russia sent 4 vessels to do these military exercises: the frigate, the Gorshkov, the nuclear submarine, the Kazan, the oil tanker Pashin, and the tugboat, the Nikolai Chika. So this wasn't exactly a full carrier fleet made up of loads of destroyers, so it wasn't really a threat to anyone anyway. Now, the US says that these were routine exercises, and US officials also say that they are to show the West that the Russian Navy is still capable of global power projection. However, exactly what Russia achieved with these military exercises is unknown, except that's a usual thing because Russia usually keeps their military exercises quite secret. One quick point from just now, Russia has announced that Putin, for the first time in over 24 years, will be visiting North Korea. and he will be doing that on the 18th, and then he will be visiting Vietnam the day afterwards. But I'll cover that next week in my next weekly news recap. However, this final part is important, at least for me. If you don't know, I've now been totally demonetized across basically every platform, and I'm actually struggling to fund the making of these videos. And I wasn't provided with a reason for any of this, it just all got taken away basically at the same time. So if you want to help fund the making of these videos so that I can continue to bring the news to you, then you can just join my Patreon. And I want to make clear, I'm definitely not asking for loads, just instead of giving the BBC your money, maybe consider giving me your £5 a month instead. And to join that Patreon, you can either go to the top link in the description, or you can go to alexbarnicoat.com and you can join it there. And for anyone that's interested, the sources for all of this information will be in the description below, along with my social media links, which you can probably see on screen now. But thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again at the same time next week.